The first person who smiled at my baby shower was also the first person who quietly wished my baby would never be born. I didn't realize it until I heard a sentence that still echoes in my mind every single night. By then, everyone thought I was simply an emotional pregnant woman imagining things. Even my own husband believed every strange accident was nothing more than bad luck. What none of us knew was that someone had been carefully turning my happiest months into a nightmare, one tiny decision at a time. The most terrifying part wasn't what she did. It was how gently she smiled while doing it. And when I finally uncovered the truth, I understood that the worst betrayals don't begin with shouting. They begin with kindness that feels just a little too perfect. I had dreamed about my baby shower for years. After 3 heartbreaking miscarriages, countless doctor's appointments, and more tears than I ever admitted to anyone, reaching 28 weeks felt like crossing a finish line I had almost given up chasing. Every ultrasound, every healthy heartbeat, every tiny kick reminded me that maybe this time, my miracle was finally real. My husband, Ethan, insisted we celebrate. He rented a private room at a cozy country club outside Columbus, Ohio, decorated with soft cream flowers, pale blue ribbons, and handmade wooden signs that read "Welcome Baby Carter." Friends and relatives filled every table, laughing over slices of vanilla cake, and passing around little prediction cards about the baby's birthday, weight, and eye color. It was exactly the kind of afternoon I had imagined during all those lonely nights when I wondered if motherhood would ever happen for me. Ethan looked happier than I had seen him in years. Every few minutes he rested his hand on my shoulder, or gently rubbed my growing belly as though he still couldn't believe our son was actually on his way. Watching him smile made every painful injection, every blood test, and every anxious doctor's visit worth enduring. His mother, Vanessa, arrived fashionably late carrying an expensive gift wrapped in elegant silver paper. She wore a flawless ivory pantsuit and the same polished smile that always made everyone else think she was the sweetest woman in the room. I had spent 4 years trying to convince myself that maybe I had simply misunderstood her distant attitude toward me. She had never openly insulted me. She never raised her voice. She simply had a remarkable talent for making every compliment feel strangely cold. That afternoon she embraced me tightly in front of everyone. People smiled as cameras flashed around us. Then, with her lips close enough that only I could hear, she whispered, "Enjoy this while it lasts." Before I could ask what she meant, she stepped back with the brightest smile imaginable and handed me the gift as if nothing unusual had happened. I searched her face for some hint that she had been joking, but all I saw was calm confidence. Moments later she laughed with my cousins, complimented the decorations, and happily posed for photographs beside Ethan. I tried to tell myself hormones were making me overly sensitive. Maybe I had misunderstood her words. Maybe she meant the baby shower itself would be over soon. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for everything. But no matter how many excuses I invented, a quiet uneasiness settled deep inside my chest. As the afternoon continued, I caught Vanessa watching me from across the room more than once. Every time our eyes met, she smiled immediately, warm enough for everyone else to admire, yet somehow empty enough to leave me feeling colder than before. I barely slept that night. Vanessa's words replayed in my mind every time I closed my eyes, but by sunrise I had convinced myself they meant nothing. Pregnancy had made me more emotional than usual, and I hated the idea of becoming the kind of person who searched for hidden meaning in every conversation. My obstetrician had warned me that stress could make ordinary situations feel overwhelming, so I promised myself I would focus on the baby instead of one unsettling whisper. The next morning I reached for the bottle of prenatal vitamins that always sat beside the coffee maker. It was gone. I searched every cabinet in the kitchen, every drawer, even the pantry, wondering if I had accidentally moved it while cleaning. Eventually I found the bottle tucked behind a stack of baking dishes in a cabinet I almost never opened. I laughed at myself, assuming pregnancy brain had finally caught up with me. A few days later I received a reminder from my medical office saying I had missed an important prenatal appointment. My heart nearly stopped. I had written the appointment on my kitchen calendar weeks earlier. When I looked at the calendar hanging on the refrigerator, the date had somehow changed by exactly 1 week. I apologized to the receptionist and rescheduled, embarrassed that I had made such a careless mistake. Dr. Rachel Morgan examined me carefully and smiled after hearing the baby's heartbeat. Everything looked reassuring, but she gently reminded me that keeping every appointment mattered because of my previous pregnancy losses. I nodded, promising it would never happen again. On my way home, I kept wondering how I could have copied the wrong date. I had always been organized. Ethan often joked that I planned holidays 6 months in advance. Forgetting something this important did not sound like me. Still, I blamed myself. That weekend, Vanessa invited us to dinner. She prepared a beautiful meal and insisted I relax while she served everyone. She had always been an excellent cook, and Ethan happily accepted a second helping of her homemade casserole. Before I reached for my own plate, Vanessa lightly touched my arm and said she had prepared a separate version because pregnant women needed something healthier. Her smile was warm enough that refusing would have seemed rude. I thanked her and took a few bites before noticing an unfamiliar herbal flavor. It was probably harmless, but something about it made me pause. When I casually asked what seasoning she had used, she answered so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. Just a family blend of herbs, sweetheart. Nothing special. Ethan smiled and kept eating, completely unconcerned. I finished only half the plate, suddenly without much appetite. Later that evening, I quietly searched the ingredients online, only to discover that several different herbs could taste similar. Some were perfectly safe during pregnancy, while others were generally discouraged because there was not enough research about their effects. I had no proof of what had been in my dinner, and I felt ridiculous even wondering about it. I closed my phone and told myself I was overthinking again. Yet over the following 2 weeks, little things continued happening. My water bottle disappeared before every doctor's visit. My pregnancy journal was found on a different shelf than where I always kept it. An envelope from my insurance company arrived already opened. None of these moments were dramatic by themselves. None of them proved that anyone wished me harm. They were simply tiny inconveniences that could easily be explained away. But when I placed them side by side, they no longer looked like random accidents. They looked like pieces of a picture that I could not quite see, and for the first time, I began wondering whether someone else had been arranging those pieces long before I noticed they were missing. I spent the next several days trying to convince myself that peace was a choice. If I stopped looking for problems, maybe they would disappear on their own. That was how I had always handled difficult people. I believed kindness could soften sharp edges and patience could heal misunderstandings. It was one of the reasons Ethan and I rarely argued. We always assumed the best about the people we loved. I wanted to believe his mother deserved that same generosity. Still, a quiet voice inside me refused to let everything go. One evening, while Ethan was loading the dishwasher, I finally gathered enough courage to tell him how uneasy I had been feeling. I carefully described the missing vitamins, the changed appointment date, the strange dinner, and Vanessa's unsettling words at the baby shower. I expected him to look surprised. Instead, he sighed gently and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Emily," he said softly, "you have been through so much already. After everything that happened before, it makes sense that you are nervous. But my mother would never intentionally hurt you or our baby." I wanted to believe him. I truly did. He reminded me that Vanessa had driven me to doctor's appointments when he had business trips. She had knitted tiny baby blankets for the nursery and spent hours helping us paint the guest room that would soon become our son's bedroom. Those were not the actions of someone who wanted us to fail. Or at least that was what Ethan believed. I nodded and apologized for bringing it up. The conversation ended with a hug, but not with relief. For the first time since we married, I felt completely alone inside my own thoughts. A week later, I stopped by Vanessa's house to return a serving dish she had loaned us after the baby shower. Her car was in the driveway, but she did not answer the front door. I was about to leave when I noticed the garage door was slightly open. I called her name, thinking she might be working in the garden. Instead, I heard her voice inside the garage speaking on the telephone. I could not hear every word clearly, only scattered fragments carried by the breeze. "He still believes," she said with a quiet laugh. "She questions everything now." Then there was a pause before she added, "No, not yet. Everything has to happen naturally." I froze for only a moment before stepping away. I did not want to eavesdrop, and I certainly did not want her to discover me standing there. Perhaps she had been discussing a neighbor, a friend, or someone completely unrelated to me. But my heartbeat refused to slow down during the drive home. That night I quietly checked my upcoming medical appointments again. Every date matched my calendar perfectly. I even photographed each page with my phone in case something changed again. The following morning another surprise waited for me. My obstetrician's office called asking why I had canceled my glucose screening appointment scheduled for the next week. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I had never canceled anything. The receptionist sounded confused because someone had called the previous afternoon, correctly confirmed my birthday and address, and politely requested the appointment be removed from the schedule. Thankfully, the cancellation had not yet been finalized because another staff member noticed my history of high-risk pregnancies and asked for additional verification. I immediately rescheduled, but after hanging up I sat motionless at my kitchen table. Until that moment, every strange event had carried a reasonable explanation. Forgetfulness, miscommunication, stress. This time there was no explanation that made sense. Someone had known my personal information. Someone had contacted my doctor's office pretending to be me. And for the first time I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. Instead, I found myself asking a far more frightening question. If someone was quietly interfering with my pregnancy, how much had they already managed to hide from me? I spent the rest of that afternoon staring at my phone, replaying the conversation with the receptionist over and over again. Whoever had called the office knew my full name, my date of birth, my address, and enough personal information to sound convincing. That was no longer something I could dismiss as pregnancy brain or simple coincidence. I wanted to call Ethan immediately, but I could already imagine the sadness in his eyes as he gently reminded me that stress could make people connect unrelated events. I did not want another conversation where I sounded frightened while everyone else sounded reasonable. Instead, I drove to Dr. Rachel Morgan's office and asked if she had a few minutes to speak with me after clinic hours. She welcomed me into her office with the same calm smile that had comforted me through months of uncertainty. I apologized for showing up without an appointment, but I explained everything that had happened, from the missing vitamins to the canceled glucose screening. I made it clear that I was not accusing anyone. I simply wanted to know whether I was becoming overly anxious. Dr. Morgan listened without interrupting. She folded her hands on her desk and remained silent for several moments before answering carefully. Emily, anxiety after previous pregnancy losses is very common, but protecting yourself is never an overreaction. If someone canceled an appointment while pretending to be you, that is something we take seriously regardless of who made the call. She immediately asked her staff to place additional security notes in my medical file. From that day forward, no appointment could be changed unless I appeared in person with identification or provided a private verification code known only to me. It was such a simple precaution that I wondered why I had not thought of it myself. Before I left, Dr. Morgan performed another examination. My son's heartbeat filled the room with its familiar steady rhythm, and for a few precious moments every fear faded away. Then her expression became more thoughtful. She measured several readings twice before looking back at me. "Everything looks stable today," she said gently, "but I would like you to reduce unnecessary stress as much as possible. Your blood pressure has been fluctuating more than I would expect." I nodded, although I almost laughed at the impossible advice. How could I avoid stress when I no longer knew whom I could trust? Driving home, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten once again. A silver sport utility vehicle had been behind me since I left the clinic parking lot. It turned when I turned and slowed whenever I slowed. After several miles, it continued straight while I entered my neighborhood, leaving me feeling foolish for even noticing it. Once again I questioned my own judgment. Was I becoming suspicious of everything simply because fear had taken root inside me? That evening Ethan found me reorganizing the nursery for the third time that week. Tiny baby clothes were folded into perfect stacks, diapers were lined up by size, and every shelf had been wiped clean twice. He smiled softly and kissed my forehead. "You are nesting early," he joked. I smiled back because it was easier than explaining that organizing the room was the only thing that made me feel as though I still had control over something. Later that night, while putting fresh sheets on the crib mattress, I discovered a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the mattress protector. At first I assumed it was part of the packaging, but when I unfolded it my hands froze. It was one of my old prenatal appointment cards with the original date that had somehow disappeared from my calendar weeks earlier. I had searched the entire house for that card. Now it had appeared inside a room that I had cleaned repeatedly. Someone had been inside the nursery. Someone had touched things that belonged to my unborn child. And whoever it was wanted me to know that nothing in my home was truly beyond their reach. I did not tell Ethan about finding the appointment card in the nursery. That decision haunted me for days, but something inside me kept insisting that if I spoke too soon, whoever had been quietly interfering would simply become more careful. I needed answers before I needed reassurance. For the first time in my life, I stopped assuming that the truth would reveal itself on its own. I began paying attention to details that I would normally overlook. Every evening before going to bed, I took photographs of the nursery with my phone. I placed a stuffed elephant facing the window, lined up 3 children's books perfectly along the edge of the bookshelf, and folded the rocking chair blanket so that one corner pointed toward the door. They looked like ordinary decorations to anyone else. To me, they became silent markers. If anything moved, I would know. 2 days passed without anything unusual. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the entire situation. Then on Friday afternoon, I returned home after meeting a close friend for lunch. The house was quiet exactly as I had left it. Nothing appeared out of place until I stepped into the nursery. The stuffed elephant had been turned toward the crib. One of the books had been pushed several inches backward. The blanket corner no longer pointed toward the door. They were tiny changes, so small that Ethan would never have noticed them. But I had the photographs to prove they were different. My pulse quickened as I compared each image on my phone with the room in front of me. Someone had entered the nursery while I was gone. I immediately checked every window and every exterior door. Everything was locked. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been broken. Whoever entered had wanted only to be there. That realization frightened me far more than if something valuable had disappeared. That evening I casually asked Ethan whether he had stopped by the house during his lunch break. He looked confused and shook his head. His office had been hosting an all-day meeting with clients from Chicago. Several coworkers had joined him for lunch downtown. His answer came so naturally that I never doubted him. Instead of pushing further, I quietly called our home security company the next morning. We had installed a simple alarm system after buying the house, but we had never activated the optional indoor cameras because they had always seemed unnecessary. The representative explained that wireless cameras could be installed within a few days. I scheduled the appointment without mentioning my growing suspicions. While waiting for the installation date, I reviewed our front door camera recordings through the security application. Most clips were exactly what I expected. Delivery drivers, neighbors walking their dogs, Ethan leaving for work, me carrying groceries inside. Then I noticed something unusual from 3 days earlier. Vanessa had stopped by while I was at a prenatal exercise class. She used the spare key that Ethan had given her years ago for emergencies. According to the timestamp, she remained inside the house for nearly 40 minutes. When I asked Ethan about it later that evening, he smiled casually. She probably dropped something off for us. She still has that key in case we ever need help. His complete lack of concern made me hesitate again. After all, she was family. Family members visited one another all the time. Still, something about the length of her visit unsettled me. 40 minutes was a long time to leave a casserole or pick up the mail. The following afternoon I found a gift bag sitting on our kitchen counter. Inside was a beautiful hand-sewn baby quilt with tiny blue stars stitched across soft white fabric. A handwritten note rested on top. For my precious grandson. Love always, Grandma Vanessa. Anyone else would have seen a thoughtful grandmother preparing for her first grandchild. I ran my fingers across the careful stitching and tried to feel grateful. Instead, I noticed a faint scent of the same unfamiliar herbal fragrance that had lingered around the special meal she had prepared weeks earlier. I could not explain why that tiny detail unsettled me so deeply, but for the first time I stopped asking whether I was being unfair to Vanessa. I started asking myself a different question entirely. Why did every path I followed somehow lead back to her? I did not confront Vanessa after discovering the security log. Instead, I did something that felt completely unnatural to me. I became quiet. I answered her cheerful text messages with short replies. I smiled whenever she visited. I thanked her for every gift she brought to the house. If someone had been watching my reactions, I wanted them to believe I had finally stopped asking questions. Inside, however, I had never been more alert. 3 days later, the indoor security cameras were installed while Ethan was at work. I told him I wanted extra peace of mind before the baby arrived, and he agreed without hesitation. The cameras covered only the main hallway, the nursery entrance, and the living room. I deliberately avoided placing one inside private spaces, because I still hoped I was simply protecting our home, rather than exposing someone I loved. The system immediately sent motion alerts to my phone whenever someone entered the house. 2 mornings later, I left for a routine prenatal exercise class. Halfway through the session, my phone vibrated. Motion detected. Front hallway. I stepped into the lobby and opened the security application. The front door opened slowly. Vanessa walked inside carrying what looked like another gift bag. She smiled to herself as she closed the door behind her. There was no emergency. No phone call from Ethan. No reason for her to be there. I watched silently as she walked through the hallway and disappeared toward the nursery. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she returned. The gift bag she had carried inside was gone. Before leaving, she paused in the living room and looked around as though making sure everything appeared exactly as she had found it. Then she quietly locked the front door behind her. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to finish my class before driving home. When I entered the nursery, nothing looked different at first glance. Then I noticed a new stuffed rabbit sitting beside the crib. Attached to one ear was a small handwritten tag. "Grandma already loves you more than words can say." It was a sweet message. Anyone else would have considered it a loving surprise. Yet I could not stop wondering why she had needed to spend nearly 20 minutes alone in that room simply to leave a toy. That evening I carefully searched every drawer, every shelf, and every storage basket. Hidden beneath a stack of folded baby blankets, I found a small white envelope with my name written across the front in Vanessa's handwriting. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a local family who had experienced pregnancy complications several years earlier. There were no notes explaining why she had saved it. No birthday card. No letter. Just the article folded neatly inside the envelope. I stared at it for several minutes, unable to understand why anyone would leave something like that inside a nursery. I placed everything back exactly where I had found it and quietly photographed the envelope before closing the drawer. Later that night, I searched old family photographs on social media. I was no longer looking at smiling faces. I was looking for patterns. I noticed that Vanessa had rarely posted pictures of Ethan and me together after our wedding. Instead, she frequently shared older photographs of Ethan with a young woman named Claire. Curious, I opened Claire's profile. Years earlier, she and Ethan had dated briefly before we met. The comments beneath several photographs caught my attention. Vanessa had once written, "You will always feel like family to me." Another comment from around the time of our engagement read, "Some stories are not over. Life has a funny way of correcting mistakes." My heartbeat slowed as those words settled into my mind. Standing alone in my living room, I realized I might have been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Perhaps this had never been about disliking me personally. Perhaps someone had spent years refusing to accept that I had become Ethan's wife, and now that I was about to become the mother of his child, that quiet resentment had finally grown into something much darker than simple disappointment. I spent the next several days pretending that everything had returned to normal. I thanked Vanessa for the stuffed rabbit. I even sent her a photograph of it sitting on the nursery shelf exactly where she had placed it. Her reply came within minutes. "It looks perfect. I knew you would love it." Reading those words, I realized something important. She wanted me to see only the version of herself that everyone else believed in. The generous grandmother. The thoughtful mother. The woman who always arrived carrying gifts instead of questions. If I suddenly accused her without undeniable proof, I would become the unstable pregnant woman everyone had already been quietly worried about. That was a risk I could not afford. Instead, I began documenting everything. Every unexpected visit. Every unusual telephone call. Every motion alert from the security system. I created a private folder on my laptop protected by a password that only I knew. Inside, I saved screenshots from the security cameras, photographs of the nursery before and after each visit, copies of appointment confirmations, and notes describing every conversation while the details remained fresh in my memory. I stopped relying on my emotions and started relying on facts. The more I documented, the calmer I became. Fear slowly gave way to patience. One afternoon, while reviewing another security recording, I noticed something I had overlooked before. Vanessa always entered the nursery carrying something in her right hand, but she almost always left with empty hands. Curious, I enlarged one of the video frames. Just before walking out of the room, she slipped a small object into the pocket of her jacket. The camera angle was not clear enough to identify it, but it was obvious she had not entered the room with that object in her pocket. She had taken something with her. My heart raced as I quietly searched through the nursery later that evening. At first nothing seemed missing. Then I reached for the pregnancy journal I had been writing since the day I heard my baby's heartbeat for the first time. The ribbon bookmark was sticking out from a different page than where I had left it. I slowly turned to that page. It described one of my previous pregnancy losses, written during a particularly emotional evening months earlier. Several sentences had been lightly underlined with a pencil that was not mine. There was no note, no message, just those carefully marked lines describing fear, grief, and uncertainty. Someone had read my most private thoughts without permission. I closed the journal and sat quietly in the rocking chair, no longer feeling angry. I felt studied, as though someone had been collecting pieces of my vulnerability instead of simply invading my privacy. That realization changed everything. The next morning I called Dr. Rachel Morgan again, not because of a medical emergency, but because I needed advice from someone who had seen many high-risk pregnancies. I carefully avoided making accusations. Instead, I explained that I wanted to reduce unnecessary visitors during the final weeks before delivery. She immediately supported the idea. She reminded me that emotional well-being was just as important as physical health, and encouraged me to create whatever boundaries made me feel safe. For the first time in weeks, a professional had validated my instincts instead of dismissing them. That afternoon, Ethan told me Vanessa wanted to stop by on Saturday to help organize baby clothes. I smiled gently and told him that sounded wonderful. Then, after he left for work the following morning, I quietly moved one small keepsake into the nursery drawer. It was an ultrasound photograph that had never been shared with anyone outside our home. I photographed exactly where I placed it and closed the drawer. If it moved, I would know. If it disappeared, I would know even more. I no longer hoped that nothing would happen. I needed the truth to reveal itself, even if it meant watching someone I had once called family make one mistake too many. I woke up before sunrise on Saturday with a strange sense of calm. For weeks I had lived with uncertainty, second-guessing every instinct and questioning every memory. That morning felt different. I was no longer waiting for reassurance. I was waiting for confirmation. Before Ethan came downstairs, I quietly checked the nursery one final time. The ultrasound photograph remained exactly where I had left it inside the drawer beneath the neatly folded baby blankets. I took another photograph with my phone, closed the drawer, and walked into the kitchen as though nothing unusual was happening. Vanessa arrived just after 10 o'clock carrying cinnamon rolls and fresh flowers. Ethan greeted her with a hug while she smiled warmly at me and asked how the baby was feeling. Her voice sounded gentle, almost comforting. If someone had met her for the first time that morning, they would have believed she was the perfect grandmother. During coffee, I casually mentioned that I needed to pick up a prescription refill from the pharmacy. Ethan immediately offered to drive with me because he also wanted to stop at the hardware store afterward. Vanessa insisted she would stay behind and finish organizing the nursery while we were gone. "You two enjoy a little break," she said with an affectionate smile. "I know exactly where everything belongs." Her words settled heavily in my mind. Exactly where everything belongs. 20 minutes after leaving the house, Ethan and I parked across the street from a small neighborhood park instead of driving to the pharmacy. I quietly opened the security application on my phone. The nursery camera showed Vanessa carefully folding tiny baby clothes with slow, deliberate movements. At first, everything appeared completely ordinary. Then she glanced toward the hallway, as though checking whether anyone might return unexpectedly. She walked to the dresser, opened the same drawer where I had hidden the ultrasound photograph, and removed the envelope containing the picture. She studied it for several long moments before slipping it into her handbag. My heart sank, but I kept watching. A minute later, she reached into her jacket pocket and removed another folded envelope. She placed it inside the drawer where the ultrasound picture had been. Then she gently closed the drawer, smoothed the blanket on the rocking chair, and smiled to herself before continuing to organize baby clothes as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan stared silently at the screen beside me. I could actually hear his breathing change. Neither of us spoke until the recording ended. Without saying a word, we drove home. Vanessa greeted us cheerfully from the nursery doorway. "Everything is almost finished," she announced proudly. Ethan looked at me instead of answering. I walked calmly into the nursery, opened the drawer, and removed the envelope she had left behind. Inside was another newspaper article describing a heartbreaking pregnancy complication from years earlier. There was also a handwritten note. "Some women are simply not meant to become mothers. Accepting that can be a blessing." The room became completely silent. I slowly handed the note to Ethan without saying a single word. His eyes moved from the paper to his mother and back again. Vanessa's confident smile disappeared for the first time since I had known her. She immediately tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that she had only wanted me to appreciate every moment, because life could be unpredictable. But her explanation collapsed the instant Ethan quietly asked one question. "Then why did you take the ultrasound photograph?" She looked down at her handbag before realizing what she had done. That tiny movement answered him before she ever spoke. Months of doubt, fear, and unanswered questions suddenly fit together with painful clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply opened the security application again and pressed play, allowing the recording to tell the story that I had spent weeks trying to understand. The recording ended, but the silence inside the nursery seemed to last forever. Ethan stood perfectly still, the phone still in his hand, staring at the woman he had trusted his entire life. Vanessa opened her mouth several times as though searching for an explanation that could somehow erase what we had all just watched. None came. Finally, she whispered that she had only wanted to protect her son from future heartbreak, insisting that she had believed I was too fragile after my previous losses. She claimed the newspaper articles were meant to prepare me for life's uncertainties, and that taking the ultrasound photograph had been nothing more than a sentimental mistake. Even as she spoke, her words felt carefully assembled instead of heartfelt. Ethan quietly reached into her handbag and removed my ultrasound picture without saying a single word. Then he placed it back into my hands. It was such a small gesture, yet it meant more to me than any speech ever could. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I no longer felt alone. That afternoon, Ethan asked his mother to leave our home. He did not shout. He did not insult her. He simply told her that trust had been broken in ways neither of us could ignore. She looked at him with disbelief, waiting for him to change his mind, but he calmly opened the front door and stood beside it until she walked outside. As her car disappeared down the street, I realized I was not celebrating a victory. I was mourning the family we thought we had. During the following weeks, we changed every lock on the house, updated every security code, and removed spare keys that had once seemed like symbols of trust. My medical appointments became peaceful again because I no longer worried about unexpected cancellations or unexplained interruptions. Dr. Rachel Morgan smiled during my final prenatal visit and told me both the baby and I were doing well. For the first time in months, I believed her without silently wondering what unseen problem might be waiting around the corner. A few weeks later, after many hours of anticipation, our son entered the world healthy and strong. When the nurse placed him in my arms, the room grew wonderfully quiet. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine with surprising strength, and every fearful memory from the previous months seemed to lose a little of its power. Ethan stood beside me with tears in his eyes, gently kissing my forehead before looking down at our son. Neither of us spoke for several moments because there were no words large enough for that feeling. We later received several letters from Vanessa asking for another chance. She apologized for crossing boundaries, but never fully accepted responsibility for the choices she had made. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as restoring access to someone's life. I wished her peace, but I also chose peace for my own family. Some doors can close without hatred. They simply close because love cannot survive where trust is repeatedly taken apart. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest gift I gave my child was not a beautifully decorated nursery or perfectly folded baby clothes. It was a home where fear no longer had permission to live. I used to believe that motherhood began the day I held my baby for the first time. I know differently now. Motherhood began the moment I trusted my instincts enough to protect the life growing inside me, even when everyone else encouraged me to doubt myself. Sometimes the strongest thing a mother can do is quietly gather the truth, patiently wait for the right moment, and let honesty speak louder than anger ever could.